extremely well educated, a brilliant mind, probably one of America's greatest military geniuses of the period. He certainly proved it during the war.
Many American military historians consider Scott's campaign against Mexico City to be the best by any American general. Never has a general accomplished more with fewer men, under harder conditions, and with less support from his government.
Scott's campaign began at Veracruz in March of 1847.
With the aid of the United States Navy, Scott was able to land an army of about 10,000 at Veracruz, in an amphibious operation that prefigured some of the more professional operations of a century later. It was a significant military feat.
This is the first time that a foreign army has landed successfully on Mexican soil at Veracruz. Scott's seizure of Veracruz is brilliant. He resolves not to take it by storm. He instead takes a very radical option of bombing a city with a very high civilian population into submission.
The enemy's first victims were women and children, followed by whole families from the effects of their explosions or under the ruins of their dwellings. From a Mexican narrative of events at the heroic city of Veracruz.
There's a great outcry over this, both by Mexicans and Americans. But Scott is successful. He secures the base, and he's ready to go.
But the going would be tough.
Scott's lines of communications back to Veracruz were threatened by parties of Mexican guerrillas. These were hard-riding, hard-hating partisans who would attack stragglers. American soldiers would often find the mutilated remains of their comrades with their hearts cut out and their tongues hanging on trees over the mutilated bodies.
Almost as unforgiving as the Mexican guerrillas was the Mexican interior itself.
Not only do you have mountains, but you also have dense jungles, either one of which would be perfect for any defending general.
Such was the case on April 17th and 18th at Cerro Gordo, the first major battle of Scott's campaign. While defending a mountain pass, Mexican General Santa Anna was defeated by storming American forces. This unlikely victory was made possible by expert reconnoitering by a member of Scott's staff.
The lieutenant that does this great reconnoitering is Robert E. Lee, who at one point almost gets caught by a Mexican patrol, has to hide behind a log for several hours while the Mexicans are on one side of the log and every creature and critter in the jungle crawling up and down his pants leg.
After the victory at Cerro Gordo, Scott had to make a difficult decision. Either press on to Mexico City before the arrival of promised reinforcements, or wait and risk being a sitting target for disease and the Mexican army.
Scott gambles. He goes for broke. He decides the capital is the most important aspect, and he moves on down the national highway. It's one of the greatest gambles an American army has ever faced up to that point.
But the gamble paid off as Scott led his small but efficient army to smashing victories at Contreras and Churubusco on August 20th.
As the campaign against Mexico City progressed, Scott became more and more paranoid about what he perceived as the administration's failure to support him and its desire to prevent him from garnering all the glory of it.
Scott's paranoia was justified, for like Zachary Taylor, he was a member of the Whig Party. This presented a big problem for President Polk, a Democrat.
He had already declared that he would not seek a second term as president, but he wanted to hold the White House for his party. Two of the last three presidents before him had been military heroes. He well knew that the general who emerged as the great hero out of this war was likely to march right into the White House in the next election. He certainly didn't want that to be Winfield Scott.
Winfield Scott had his own political aspirations. He too wanted to be president and ultimately did in fact run for president, only to be defeated.
Lacking support from his commander-in-chief, Scott still emerged victorious at the Battle of Molino del Rey on September 8th. Now only the fortified heights of Chapultepec Castle, the National Military School, stood between Scott and Mexico City.
This is a great moment of pride and honor for the Mexican soldier to have to defend his national capital. It's the first time the capital has been threatened since Herman Cortez. So for the Mexicans, it's a great trauma point. And for the Americans, it is going to be a very near-run thing to accomplish.
The Battle of Chapultepec on September 12th and 13th would be the last and perhaps most important battle of the war.
At a signal, the stormers with planks and ladders moved beautifully and steadily up to the base of the hill under a shower of balls. The difficulties were great, and the contest was foot by foot. But the stormers succeeded in scaling the walls in spite of iron and lead and rocks and clubs. Soon the stars and stripes were floating over their famed castle, announcing that the work was done. Lieutenant John James Peck.
If the Mexican War is considered a preview of the Civil War, then Chapultepec foreshadowed the Battle of Gettysburg.
Just at Chapultepec alone, the irony of characters involved. We have Armstead, we have Longstreet, we've got Winfield Scott Hancock watching the assault from his sickbed. We have George Pickett, probably being the guy that carried the American colors over the works.
After the great American victory at Chapultepec, Santa Anna is reputed to have shaken his head and said that I believe that if we were to plant our batteries in hell, the Yankees would take them from us. And one of his staff officers looked at him and shook his head and said, God is a Yankee.
On September 14th, General Winfield Scott entered Mexico City with his army of 6,000 men. The war was over, but peace was still far off.
When Scott occupied Mexico City in September of 1847 and Santa Anna fled the country, the war was essentially over. But there was no one to make peace. Nicholas Trist, our negotiator, had traveled with the general, but he had no one to negotiate with. And for 5 months, the search for someone to sign away on the conquest of northern Mexico continued. During this period, in the United States, a new debate arose. How much of Mexico to take?
There was an all-Mexico movement afoot in the Congress. There were those who simply wanted to annex all of Mexico into the United States, a move that would have proven disastrous for both countries.
First of all, we would have to go subjugate the rest of the country, which means the United States probably be fighting for 10 years down there. The local population would have undoubtedly rose in a more organized, more brutal guerrilla warfare than it did initially. Also, it's not meeting the objectives of Polk's administration. The boundary question settled. We've got California. We've got the Northern Territories. This is all we want.
The real reason that the all of Mexico movement failed was American racism. How would we govern an alien, non-English speaking people with different social and religious institutions?
The all-Mexico movement failed, but it did succeed in forcing Mexican officials to the peace table. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2nd, 1848.
By the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Rio Grande was recognized as the boundary of Texas. New Mexico and California were acquired by the United States, and the United States would pay to Mexico $15 million for this new country. Now, in the United States, an enormous debate erupted over this treaty. It was, those who opposed it said, far too generous. Why in the world should we pay anything for territory we had conquered fair and square?
The Mexican War resulted in a great deal of guilt. In fact, historians refer to it as national war guilt, in which the United States paid $15 million to Mexico after the war.
Whether it was because of guilt or adherence to President Polk's initial aims, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was ratified by the Senate on March 10th. And with that, one of the most controversial conflicts in American history was finally over.
The Mexican War cannot be looked on in any other terms than an unjust war of conquest. It probably was an immoral war. At the same time, we cannot diminish the significance of that war in terms of what the United States is today. It brought into our national domain all of what are today the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. The Mexican War, as represented in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, made the United States a continental nation.
But the war had other, perhaps more ironic consequences.
It was the result of the Mexican War and that devastation that brought, finally, national unity and a true sense of nationalism to Mexico. It forced them into reforming the government. It caused them to consider modernization. It brought them into the 20th century.
The United States would pay a terrible price for waging this aggressive war against a weaker neighbor. The territory was conquered. But now the Americans began to argue over what to do with it and whether it was to be slave or free. Eventually, a great compromise in 1850 would settle some of these questions, but not the major question. It festered and it grew, and the conquest of territory in the Mexican War was the essential ingredient that helped bring on the American Civil War. The poison that seeped in to the American body politic would eventually destroy the Union and lead to the deaths of 600,000 young American men. There was a terrible price to pay indeed for the conquest of the West.
Every moment, every milestone of every personality. For 20 years, Biography has left conjecture and innuendo to the other shows. You know, the ones that come and go.